Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Three-quarters of graduates will never repay their student loans, with the poorest facing the biggest debt. That's according to comprehensive analysis from the Institute of Fiscal Studies. It estimates that students in England will graduate with average debts of £50,800 after interest rates are raised on student loans to 6.1%. That's due to happen in the autumn. Let's speak to some students now. In a moment, we'll speak to Jade Simpson. She's just arrived. Hello, Jade. Come in. She's 24 and she graduated from the University of East London in 2014 with £28,000 debt. In Salford is Luke Dix. He's 21. He's a second-year physics student at Manchester Uni. And in Birmingham, we've got Amity Doku, who's a former Cambridge graduate, who is Vice President of the National Students' Union. Welcome, all of you. Jade, you left uni in 2014. How much debt have you got right now?
I think it's roughly 28,000.
OK. Amity, what about yourself?
I don't like thinking about it, but I think it's about 30,000.
OK. And when you graduate, Luke, what will yours be, do you reckon?
I should imagine it'll be about 55,000.
OK. So, Jade, how do you deal with the £28,000 debt? Mentally, apart from anything else?
Yeah, I think mentally I've kind of put it to one side, but then in terms of like my salary and seeing that come out, I think that's where I'm like, oh, like it's quite a lot of money when I could be kind of like saving and things like that for a house. And yeah.
Do you mind me asking what you pay back each month at the moment?
Yeah, so it's roughly about £58, which is not that high, but then with like travel in London and like rent and things like that, it is quite a lot that's taken out of my salary.
Right. Yeah. But that's what you spend on your education?
Yes, yeah, no, definitely. And I do think it's worth it. However, I do just think that in terms of I'm glad that I didn't come in at the higher fees, because I don't know if my decision would have been affected by that or not. Right. So, yeah.
OK. Luke, when you start repaying this back, which will only happen when you reach the current threshold, which is 21,000, that may change as the years go by, I suppose, how will you approach it?
I'm not going to worry about it too much. It's more like a tax than anything else, so it comes out from your employer's contributions to your salary. So I don't think it's going to affect me day to day. You sort of will always have that debt, so you won't. It's not like a new debt that you have to worry about paying. It comes off your wages every month, exactly the same, depending on what you're earning. And I'm going to be in the situation, probably because I want to do sort of physics research, where I'm not actually going to earn enough to pay it off anyway, but it's still not going to bother me.
Right, because after 30 years, if you haven't paid the whole thing back, it gets written off. Yeah. And do you feel it's the right decision that you're paying for your university education as opposed to general taxpayers?
Yeah, because I've got a brother that's doing an apprenticeship at the moment in engineering, and I don't particularly think it's fair for him or someone like my parents or someone in my parents' situation that didn't go to university to pay for my privilege of actually having a really top quality world-class education.
Amity, do you agree with the Universities Minister, Jo Johnson, that effectively this student finance system, this system of loans, is removing barriers to people from disadvantaged backgrounds going to uni?
No, I completely disagree, and as the research came out today, you can clearly see that those from disadvantaged backgrounds end up worse off, leaving university with about over £57,000 worth of debt. But I think it comes back to that central point. It's about how we look at higher education, how we look at education. Is it essential for our society to have doctors, engineers, sociologists and historians who are all contributing to our society? And it shouldn't be seen as something that an individual gets and then goes off to do what they want. The public should be investing in our students so that they can in turn invest back into society. You know, this isn't about, it's not a luxury, it's not a business. This should be about society deciding as a whole to make an investment into young people so that we too can then return that investment back into our society.
Why do you think it is then that the numbers of 18-year-olds from the most disadvantaged areas is going up when it comes to university? In 2006, 12.2% of 18-year-olds from the most disadvantaged areas applied to uni. In In 2010, it went up to 18%. In 2017, it's 22.5%.
But I mean, look, I understand that, and I think it's
Why
great.
Do you think it is?
Well, more and more young people are going to university because they see the opportunities and they see, you know, I'm delighted about that. I think it's really, really important.
But they're not being put off then by the loan system.
Well, what I would say about that is that research came out last week that suggests they're more likely to drop out. But they are receiving higher debts. And I think
drop out could be for a number of reasons. Are you saying it's because of the debt they're accruing?
Yeah, well, yes. I mean, there's a whole range of reasons why they might be, and we need to also look at the whether or not they're able to make ends meet while they're actually at university, because of the move from loans the move from grants to loans. We know that students' finance is a major issue when we speak to students on the ground. But ultimately, you know, when I'm day to day talking to students on the ground, they see this as an unfair intergenerational inequality. We're being lectured by individuals who had a free education themselves and who are using that education in public service, in other walks of life, and they're telling us that actually we now have a fairer system because we are now in £57,000 worth of debt. And I think your viewers and everybody around the country will understand that that's a very, very difficult argument to make, and one that will consistently hurt the government at the ballot box if they don't engage in this conversation. Thank
you very much. That's Amity Doku, Vice President of the National Students' Union. Also Luke Dix, thank you, second-year physics student at Manchester Uni, and Jade Simpson. Thank you very much for coming on the programme. Graduated from the University of East London back in 2014.
Now, there's a warning that high fees and big loans are leaving English graduates with the largest student debts in the developed world. According to the Institute for Fiscal Studies, students from the poorest families starting university this September will leave with an average debt of £57,000, while students from the richest households will leave university with average borrowings of £43,000. 77% of those with student loans will never repay them in full. And from September, students will pay 6.1% interest on their loans.
Government funding for undergraduate education is mostly comprised of these student loans. So 96% of the money spent out is through these loans, which means that the long-run cost to government is heavily dependent on these graduate repayments, which means that it's particularly sensitive to long-run growth in graduate earnings and the government cost of borrowing.
Well, our political correspondent Darren McCaffrey is here. And Darren, it has been talked about a lot recently. Is there any hope for students that actually the current government could do something with tuition fees?
I think probably not. They've put and the Prime Minister did Prime Minister's Question Time in the last hour or so, make a pretty robust defence of the current system. But you're right, it was clearly a big issue during the general election campaign. Labour have promised to scrap those tuition fees. It clearly played well with younger voters who look at these eye-watering figures of debt. And in university towns up and down the country, a lot of people did switch the support to the Labour Party. I think in part, actually, what is really interesting today, these figures from the Institute for Fiscal Studies, Jane, is this idea about interest. The interest is at 6%. Now, that is way above the Bank of England's base rate. The government defend that by saying that they don't carry out credit checks on students beforehand. That is an entirely different system than getting credit from elsewhere. But it is clearly what is compounding the problem, and particularly for disadvantaged kids, in the sense that, yes, they have access to more support, i.e. to more money, but it is also a loan rather than a grant. And so they are also more likely to pay more interest. But the government is saying that it would cost £11 billion for all of us, for all taxpayers, if they got rid of tuition fees, and that ultimately, as we heard again from the Prime Minister in Parliament, that there are 40% more kids from disadvantaged backgrounds going to university than there were in 2009, and that actually these extra tuition fees, and indeed the interest, and indeed even that £50,000 figure, is not discouraging them from doing so.
OK, Darren, thanks very much. Most graduates will still be paying off student loans into their 50s, and 3/4 will never clear the debt, according to the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Let's go live to Birmingham, where we can talk to Robbie Young, Vice President for Society and Citizenship at the National Union of Students. Thanks for joining us, Robbie. Can I ask you a personal question? How much debt do you have so far?
So I actually went to university under the £3,000.
And is that still continuing to rise, or is that it now?
Yeah, so definitely there's an interest rate on that, which accrues every year. And it's something that NUS has been against for many years now. And we've said, this system is both flawed and it's failing. And it's failing the poorest students in our education system, where we're seeing working class students leaving with up to £57,000 worth of debt. And this comes after yet another broken promise from this government around protecting the poorest students.
Do you think you'll ever pay it off?
I don't think so, no. And I think that the high debts and the high interest rates that are put on students and graduates, they're bad. And they're not just bad for students, they're not just bad for graduates, but they're also bad for the taxpayer, because it's the taxpayer that has to pick up the tab when students, like you just said, 3/4 of students can't afford to pay off their debt.
Having said that, though, the government will point to the fact that there are 40% more students from disadvantaged backgrounds who are at university now than they were in 2009, 2010. So in terms of social mobility and in terms of getting people who are able, but perhaps previously were financially unable to get to university, it is helping a lot of people.
Wow. Also, last week, a statistic came out that shows that a record-breaking stats of working class students are dropping out of education. And they're doing so because of the scrapping of maintenance loans to loans. They're doing so because of the hike in living costs, and they're doing so because students can't afford to be at university anymore. So I think it's fantastic that more working class students are getting into university, but unfortunately they're not staying in university, so they're not being able to get the education that they deserve. And take for example my friend, she's about to start her nursing degree next month or in September, and she's going to leave education in £57,000 worth of debt for just wanting to look after us when we're most vulnerable and look after our children. We have to start asking questions: why are students put in such huge debts when we want to contribute to society?
I mean, I was sort of on the very edge of student loans the first sort of few years that it came in, but that wasn't for my fees. That was loans to help you live. And I was lucky enough to have a great time at university. I studied hard, but it was a carefree time as well. I wasn't really burdened by debt. I look back on those days, it's great, those were happy times. But I'm just wondering, students today, is there a psychological impact of this debt building up over time?
Absolutely, and it's a reason why so many students are dropping out of education. And it's interesting how, Joe Johnson and Michael Gove, they didn't have to pay tuition fees, yet they're saying now that it's okay that we pay £57,000 worth of fees back to the education system. And just a few weeks ago we talked Theresa May talking about how there isn't a magic money tree, but I think there is a magic money tree. I think it's her party's logo. She managed to hit it to give £1 million to Northern Ireland. So I think it's about time they shook that money tree to give it back to education, so that we can all get the education that we all deserve.
But in terms of the education that we deserve, I also recall that back in the day there were also quite a lot of people at university who didn't really want a degree, but they just wanted to put off getting a job for 4 years, and they were having a rare old time. I mean, have you sensed that because students these days are having to pay for it, that they are much more serious about the courses that they are choosing and how much work they're actually doing?
I think it's how you see education as a whole. So do you see it as a public good? Or I don't really think people go to education to have 4 years off. I mean, I certainly didn't have my years off going to the library for 12 hours a day reading and doing my stuff for my dissertation or my exams. I think that students are under increased pressures, and like I said earlier, because of the austerity measures brought in by this government, with the higher rents, the worst living conditions that we've seen in a very long time, and the hike of tuition fees and the scrapping of maintenance grants, these are all pressures that are putting on students. Never mind, pressures. Never mind when in education, these are barriers that are outside it too, and accumulate into not quite the good time of many would have seen before. But students do thrive in education, do have fun, but the barriers are huge, and it's why so many are dropping out.
OK, Robbie Young from the National Union of Students, thanks very much.
Thanks.
It was one of the key issues in the recent election, the cost of going to university and the debt students pile up. Now, a new study from the respected Institute for Fiscal Studies has revealed the extent of that debt. Those from the poorest backgrounds will owe up to £57,000, and 3/4 of them will never clear it. However, the government says that those from poorer backgrounds are now going to university at a record rate, up 43% since 2009. Here's our education editor, Bramwyn Jeffries.
That make us loans now.
A sunny afternoon on campus, but in the background, the pressure of debt. Many students want tuition fees scrapped.
I was the first year to experience the 9k debts. It means that many students will leave higher education with a lifetime of debt they will never be able to pay back.
People I know have struggled to work and to continue with their coursework. Some of them have even been forced to drop out.
We don't just need engineers, linguists, computer programmers and medics to run a society. We also need people who generate culture, people who think about society, imagine the new societies that we're going to build.
Student debt in England is rising. Here's why. £9,000 a year tuition fees, 6.1% interest from September, a threshold frozen at £21,000 in earnings to start to repay, with up to £57,000 in total debt for poorer students. They now have loans for living costs, not grants. The money from tuition fees has allowed universities to expand, and despite the tuition fee increases, growing numbers of young people are applying to study for a degree. So what's changed? Well, today's report shows just how much the burden of debt has increased for the poorest students. And for the first time in many years, there's a different kind of political debate about tuition fees. Still, ministers say this is about sharing the cost fairly.
Between the individual student who goes on, in most circumstances, to have much higher lifetime earnings, and the general taxpayer, who in many cases won't have had a chance to go to university and have those higher earnings.
Close to the university, the leafy Regent's Park estate, people working hard, paying taxes.
People that get a good job, solicitors, barristers and all that, yes, they can afford to pay it back, but a lot of people leave college with good grades and find it very difficult to get a job.
The 3,000 level was affordable to normal human beings, i.e. not the rich, but 9,000 is a little bit too much for education.
If they get the rewards at the end of it, then obviously it's worth it, isn't it? And it's worth, I suppose, getting the debt. So I suppose there's two ways of looking at it.
There are indeed, and with more poor students dropping out, we haven't heard the end of it. Bronwyn Jeffries, BBC News.
Will tuition fees in England stay or go? Labour wanted to scrap them, and following the Tories' disastrous election result, it looks like the government was listening. Over the weekend, Theresa May's closest ally, Damien Green, stated that there should be a national debate on fees. So today would seem like a good day to indicate the thinking of the government. That's because the IFS has released a report which says that students in England are going to graduate with an average debt of nearly £51,000 and will be paying it off well into their 50s. The response? University Minister Joe Johnson has launched a robust defence of the system. He's with me now. Good evening to you. I mean, Joe Johnson, the government's message to the country that it's absolutely paramount that we pay off the country's debt, we become solvent. And yet your message to students seems to be, well, if you've got debt of 51,000 and it lasts for many, many years, it doesn't matter. That's a kind of inconsistent message, isn't it?
No, we have a world-class higher education system. 3 universities in the world's top 10, 19 in the world's top 100, 81 in the world's top 1,000. They need to be sustainably funded, and we need to share the cost of that funding fairly between the individual student who goes on to have high lifetime earnings, higher than those who don't get a chance to go to university, and the general taxpayer who may often not go to university. We need to share that cost fairly, and that's why we have this system.
But you called Jeremy Corbyn a liar when he said that the fees discourage poor students from going on to universities. It's simply not fair, and you said he was a liar. Before, poor students had maintenance grants. Now they don't have maintenance grants. So poor students have maintenance loans, and they also have their tuition loans. They have their student loans. So therefore, poorer students come off worse.
Well, I didn't use the word liar. What I said was he's factually wrong. The number of students from disadvantaged backgrounds is at a record high.
But maintenance grants
high, and our finance system is enabling them to go to university in record numbers.
But you do accept that poorer students are worse off when they come out because they don't have maintenance grants anymore. They have maintenance loans.
I don't accept
if they get a well-paid job, they're worse off.
No, I don't accept that. The government has made more financial support available to people from disadvantaged backgrounds, so they have the cash in hand to enable them to go through university. Now, these loans are only repaid once they're in a graduate job earning above £21,000. So they're not saddled with debt, as you say. They don't have to repay until they're earning.
But poorer students have to pay back more, and they are worse off than a lot of other students. And they're worse off if they get a good job. They're actually worse off.
A different way of putting it is to say the government
But it's the right way of putting it.
No, not necessarily. The government is making more financial resources available to people from poorer backgrounds, so they have a chance to go to university, and they are.
But you wanted to have different kinds of students. I mean, this government is all about continued learning and so forth. You wanted to have mature students, you wanted to have part-time students. But there has been a drop in mature students and part-time students of 56% since tuition fees came in. Exactly the opposite of what you wanted in the last 5 years.
Well, there are many reasons why we've seen a decline in part-time students.
But presumably you're very upset about it.
One of the reasons is that so many more people are going to university for the first time when they're younger and are therefore not seeking to acquire higher education later in life. That's one reason.
But people need to retrain, don't they, as their jobs change?
A second reason is we've got an exceptionally strong labour market, so the appeal of part-time education diminishes relative to the attractions of going into work when there are those opportunities.
You're just saying that actually the appeal of part-time work diminishes in climates like at the moment. Part-time study.
When there's a buoyant labour market, the opportunity cost of going into part-time study is higher than when there are fewer jobs around. That's true.
So in fact, we have now a diminishing of part-time students.
Well, we have a buoyant labour market, which means that there are lots of job opportunities out there for people to go to. But I'm not denying there have been barriers of finance to part-time study, and that's why, as a government, we've recently put in a part-time maintenance loan for the first time on an equivalent basis to full-time, and that will help address some of these financial barriers.
But also leave poor students, because mature students and part-time students tend to be the poorest students, so they're going to proportionately, again, have more debt, even if they're in well-paid jobs.
The point is, this is about sharing the cost of how we fund a world-class higher education system. We've got a system that has seen a 25% per student increase in funding since our reforms of the student finance system in the last Parliament. That is a great situation. It means we've got great universities. We want that to continue.
But you have a situation in the United Kingdom where the debt, £50,000 and £50,800. That is double the regular US debt that students comes out with. You can't be happy about that. Double what they pay in American universities?
We need to ensure that we have a sustainably funded university system and that the cost of that funding is shared fairly between the general taxpayer who may not have a chance to go to university or may not have gone to university, and the individual student who will have a much higher lifetime earning trajectory than the general taxpayer.
Are you actually happier with that?
Are you happy with that? It's a fair system to share the cost of funding higher education in this country. The OECD, which looks at finance systems of higher education around the world, has said that we are one of the few countries in the world to have cracked it.
But just let me be clear, you say you're happy that our debt burden for students is twice the American one.
Look, what I'm happy with is we have a sustainable student finance system that enables more people from disadvantaged backgrounds to go through university than ever before. You're 43% more likely to go to university if you're from a disadvantaged background today than you were in 2009, 2010. And that's
but the thing is that I think that the situation
that's why Jeremy Corbyn is wrong to say that working class children, working class students are going to university less than before. He's factually wrong to say that.
If everything is rosy in the garden, why is the Deputy Prime Minister, Damien Green, saying that he thinks that there could be a debate about tuition fees in England? Now, he is second in charge, you might have noticed, Theresa May. You are the Universities Minister. You disagree with him. It's yet another example of this government looking in two directions at once.
No, absolutely not. Damien is absolutely right to say we need a debate that exposes the shortcomings of Labour's tuition fees
No, that's not what he was suggesting. He was suggesting that actually you need to look at the issue of the cost and the debt of tuition fees to students in the UK right now, not under a Labour government.
I think if you read his comments carefully, what he was calling for was time to expose the shortcomings of Labour's tuition fees policies. These would lead to our universities being unsustainable. It would lead to the reimposition of student number controls, which we've taken off, and that would stop more people from disadvantaged backgrounds having a chance to go to university.
Can I just be absolutely clear then? What you're saying is there'll be absolutely no change to the system under this Conservative government.
What I'm saying is we've got a good system. It's enabling more people from disadvantaged backgrounds to go to university than ever before. It's sustainably funding our universities. It's working. We have a world-class system, and we wouldn't want to change the fundamental features. Of course, we always keep it under review to ensure it's fair and effective, and that will remain the case.
Joe Jones, thank you very much indeed.
I've been getting